Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I have too much free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, while you newbie noob nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Today's ink is by Private Reserve, which I only have in the cartridge form. Tanzanite. Kind of living in this Kaweco Ice sport with a medium nib. It's one of my knock-around pens that sort of rumbles around in the bottom of my bag, so it's looked better. Let's look at the chromatography. Now, it's actually a pretty purple ink. It's coming out a lot bluer on screen, but yeah, it is like borderline blue, but it's mostly purple. As you can see, there's some potential for water resistance. And then it gets darker, and there's this nice rich band up at the top that almost looks like it has some sheen, but not much sheen seen on the paper test. Starting from the top down in density, 90 grams per square meter, if my camera would focus. As you can see, it is kind of one of those purples that, you know, if it were next to the right color, it would just be assumed to be blue. Dry time was pretty good. It was 9 seconds. There is some shading, which is nice. Always nice to have that character. There's good flow. Like a lot of Private Reserve inks, it's pretty saturated. Yeah, I said that the shading might be more noticeable in a stub or in a flexier pen. No bleed, feather, or spread. And no sheen seen on this paper, but water test I felt was actually pretty good. It did dye the paper around it, but yeah, it's pretty readable. Next is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter. Again, good saturation, still get some shading, which I hope you can see. 5.5 seconds to dry, which was pretty impressive. I said it wasn't extensive shading or showy, but it is kind of there, which I hope is showing up on the screen. But again, no bleed, feather, or spread. Very clean. That's marker. And I felt a pretty good water test. Again, it dyed the paper around it, but you might be able to hear that. It did start to come apart just a little bit. And this is a medium nib, and it's not overly wet because these really saturated inks tend to be a little more temperamental generally, but this one, the flow was pretty good. Next is Tomoe River Paper, where it took 8 seconds to dry, which I felt was pretty impressive for such a saturated ink on this paper. It came out very dark, some shading, not a lot. I think just the way that this paper makes ink pool up, yeah. The water test was not fantastic. I mean, that's pretty light, but it didn't dye the paper around it quite as much as it did before. No bleed, feather, spread. Some show through in these really dark parts, but it's fairly thin paper. And it didn't smear once it was dry, which really saturated inks, especially ones that can potentially have sheen, can be somewhat problematic. Here's 20-pound copier paper. 3 seconds dry, which really wasn't bad. I said there were still hints of shading because it's not quite as noticeable, but it's there in the wettest parts, like in the A's in Tanzanite. You can pick up that a little bit. I said it was okay for professional settings, which I think it is. I think it came out kind of bluish on this, and I know my mother had this in one of her fountain pens for a while, and she didn't even notice it was purple until I wrote with it next to a very blue ink, and she was like, oh, that's kind of purplish. But anyways, here's the water test. I actually would have expected a bit better from such absorbent paper. That's very light. It's not terribly readable. So oddly, it did better on the fancier, less absorbent papers, which is not usually the case. Next is Mead Notebook Paper. where there was a bit of feathering, but not as much as I would have thought. And there was a little bit of spread, but again, not as much as I would have thought. And there was a bit of bleed through, really not as much as I would have thought. So I think it actually did fairly well on this paper. Like you can see here in the water test, only little bits of it came through to the other side, which when paper is this cheap, that's pretty impressive. And the dry time was pretty good. I said the color was flattened, which I feel it was. There wasn't a lot of character. I felt that some of the vibrancy had been robbed from it, because this is a very like bright, vibrant kind of a purplish blue. I felt the water test was pretty good. There was some spreading and feathering and explodey sort of thing going on, but it's pretty readable, and it didn't dye the paper that much. And lastly is Moleskin Paper, where I was surprised by how long it took it to dry. I said it was excellent in bleed, feather, and spread for this paper and this size nib, because a lot of times you have to use a very tiny nib on paper this absorbent and troublesome. And yeah, I felt the water test was actually pretty good. It was a little explodey, but it could have been worse. Didn't dye the paper that much, and it's fairly dark and clear, which I thought was good. And as you can see, that's really not that bad. I feel like I might even write on the other side of this, and I'm pretty picky. It comes through in spots in places, but really not that much. And I mean, even the water test was fairly well behaved. So there you go. There's Private Reserve Tanzanite. It's a purple that can kind of pass for a blue on some days. It's got great shading, it's very saturated, it looks fantastic on the fancier papers, and is actually pretty well behaved on the cheaper papers. Not always in the water test, but that's for emergencies. So anyways, did very well in this medium nib for your consideration. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And so long from the Triple N Network. Bye.